one of the first places that I visited, and apparently is sort of promoted as the mother church of the Black Hills, is the Christ Church in Lead. And it's a very important church because it's a little, about the same time as this church, but there was a big outside influence when the Home State Mine Company came in, and the Hearsts from California were involved. And so they brought in a lot of sophisticated people who were very much into the arts, the women especially, and the way that they got them to come out here is they said, well, you can do all this art stuff. And so they did. And so this church was received a lot of money from the Hearst family, from the George Hearst from the Home State Mining Company, and their key go-to guy was a man by the name of Thomas Greer, who was their superintendent at the mine. And this is his picture, or his statue that sits. This is what the church looked like originally, and as you've been up to Lead, you know that it doesn't look like that now, okay? What was really important was that this was sort of the entrance to the kindergarten that Phoebe Hearst established for the children of Deadwood. During the late Victorian era, large companies and large people like the Hearst, like Jay Gould, like the Vanderbilts, were very concerned about the people who worked for them, and so they tried to establish amenities. And Phoebe Hearst, sort of like the Jane Hull House in Chicago, same idea. And so Phoebe Hearst, in the basement of the Christ Church, which the Hearst contributed a lot of money to, established a kindergarten. And you can kind of see that was the entrance to the kindergarten. Okay, Tom, thank you.
Not working.
Not working. Well, all right. This is new development. Let's see what we can do without this. There, okay, all right. This is what it looks like today. This is probably more familiar. You see they moved the statue of Thomas Greer over, and it's now it's near the church. Okay, next one, if we can get it. This is the interior, the chancel, the altar area, and their windows are the four Gospels and the risen Christ are in the center. Okay, next one. Their windows, like yours, are kind of this geometric thing, and probably even more abstract than your windows. But as you can see, up here at the top, they have medallions that include, here's their cross and crown, much smaller than yours, and maybe because they had Hearst money, they didn't have to suffer as much as your church. But anyway, they maybe suffered a little. They could have a cross and a crown. Okay, next one. And then this was an early picture of Jesus. Sometimes it's really hard. When I first saw this, I've seen this image several times, and I didn't quite know who it was, but it's Jesus as a young man. And next picture. And then at St. John in Deadwood, there's some lovely windows. A little bit younger church than the one up at Lead. Okay, next one, if you can get it. Okay, and you can see again, we have the medallions and the geometrics. This is opalescent glass, and we have the medallion that's a close-up, the Alpha and Omega, Christ, the first and the last. And these are separate pieces of glass, which are the glasses washed with a silver wash, and then it's painted with lead-based paint, and then put back into the oven, and so then this actually becomes part of the stained glass. Okay, next one. This illustrates the importance of why we protect windows in South Dakota, and I was so fortunate to meet the person when I was here. Her picture was in the paper with me, who wrote the grant to get the money to protect your windows. And I was really surprised when I went to Deadwood, which is where they have the Deadwood Fund that they're passing out money. They're not protecting their own windows. And this was in St. John's up in Deadwood, and you can see either they're not protected from the outside, and either it was a BB gun or a piece of hail or something totally destroyed one of the panes in some ways they're really lucky that it's not a painted window, because this glass is kind of a rolled, machine-made glass. And most of that glass was made in Kokomo, Indiana, and the company is still in business. And they still have the recipe, and they can pretty much reproduce a piece of glass for you. If it was painted, you can't ever replace that. But this could be replaced, but it's very expensive and very pricey. When the windows are exposed to the elements, you often have problems with leading, buckling, and breaking. And so it's really, really important that you protect your windows. And I'm so glad yours are protected. Okay, next. When I've been going throughout the state, I've not only been looking at churches, but I've also been looking at residences. And between 1880, 1870, and around 1920, in the homes of well-to-do people, there was often stained glass. And the Adams house up in Deadwood has some very nice examples. Next picture. No, I'm going to walk over there and go, right? Yeah.
Push your fingers out instead of... You got it?
Okay, I think it's just kind of touch. At the Adams house, we have some lovely glass around the door at the transom and in the side panels. And these are geometric. Again, we kind of have that fan-shaped. Maybe they were Christian. They wanted to be reminded of their baptism. Or maybe they didn't really know what the symbol was, but they just liked it, and the glassmakers sold it to them. I'm not sure. I don't know what the Adams were. This is a Tiffany lamp. Okay, next one.
Can you tell whether those were made for that house or whether they got them from a church and built it?
I think they were probably made for the house. Most of these wealthy women went to the Chicago's World's Fair, or the St. Louis World's Fair. They took the train and they went to the World's Fair, and that was sort of the flowering of the stained glass era. And so they met all of the artists who made it, and they commissioned these pieces of stained glass for their homes. So these probably weren't in churches. They were probably bought for that space. Okay, this one a little out of focus, but I'm sorry, the Adams house, I need to talk to them. When you take the tour, they don't want you to take pictures, and I tried to reproduce this from their brochure, and it didn't reproduce real well, but it's one of my favorite windows in South Dakota. It's a Celtic knot, and it was probably made in Chicago, because there was the O'Shaughnessy Glass Company in Chicago they were famous for this Celtic knot. So sometimes when things aren't signed, and in churches they're often not signed because it's sacred space and artists don't want to be accused of advertising and affronting God in sacred space, so they tend not to sign them. But in homes, sometimes they still don't sign them. So the way you have to identify them is by the style, by the color, do they use jewels, what kind of glass are they using? There's some ways that, sometimes people who bought them have the sales receipt still to the glass company, so you really have to be a sleuth to figure out where these windows came from. Okay, next window. One of the things I wanted to talk to you about was the Native American windows in this state, because the Episcopal Church from its very beginning in South Dakota has been very involved with the Native American people here. And I'd like to, this window is at the school in Chamberlain, the St. Joseph's Indian School in Chamberlain. And as you can see, on the left-hand side, it's more of a picture tells a story window. And then on the right-hand side, it's Native American iconography. In Lakota spirituality, there are 7 areas of Lakota spirituality, which are basically equivalent to the 7 sacraments of the Catholic Church. And so in this particular place, you'll have on the left-hand side the history of in this case, the Catholics coming, and then on the right side you'll have the Native American spirituality. As you probably know, when the Indian reservations were created, and this has been sort of a source of some of our difficulty with the Native American community, when the reservations were created, there was a real push by people like Phoebe Hearst and others of that era that they wanted to basically eliminate the culture and the heritage of the Native Americans and Americanize them and make them more like the Western Europeans that were wealthy. And so when the government created the reservations, it actually assigned a religion to different parts of the reservation, mostly by geographic, not anything to do with the wishes of the people. They just sort of divided it up between the Episcopalians and the Congregational and the Catholics and assigned a religion. And that's caused us a lot of trouble now. And thankfully, especially since Vatican II and the Catholic Church, and I think the Episcopal Church was always more welcoming of Native American spirituality, things have changed, and you can really see that change as you look at the Native American windows, the windows associated with Native Americans in the state. Okay, next slide. This is from your bishop, Bishop Hare's annual report in about 1890, 92, right around the time of Wounded Day. As you know, Bishop Hare came from the East, and he came out here with the specific job of preaching to the Native Americans. And so, but in order to do that, even then, you needed money. And so he would publish a report every year that he sent to his patrons back on the East Coast soliciting money. And this was one of the colored etchings in that book, in his report that's at the State Library in Pierre, or the State Archive. And it shows the church, Church of the Holy Cross, which is the church in Pine Ridge. And it shows the log cabins, you don't call it a rectory, parsonage. I think it says missionaries log house. And so this was what Bishop Hare was sending to the people back east to raise funds so that he could continue his work out here. And I just think that's a totally amazing, considering it's over 100 years old, considering an amazing image of what was going on at Pine Ridge. Okay, next picture. This is in the present Holy Cross Church in Pine Ridge, which is a different church than the one that was there in that image that Bishop Hare. And about the 1920s, that original church was moved, and I'll show you a picture of it in a couple of minutes, and a more modern church was used. Again, drawing on the support from back east, this window was sent to Pine Ridge and installed in that church there. As you can see, it's a very Christian window, very European, with iconography that really does not include any Native American spirituality at all. Okay, next window. What's really sort of interesting about windows is they're kind of expensive, depending on when you're purchasing them. Your windows here probably cost, the big window probably cost between $800 and $1,000, which doesn't sound like very much in today's economy, but back then that was a lot of money. So oftentimes churches don't put in all of their windows all at one time, and that certainly was the case at Holy Cross. This window was put in probably the late 60s, early 70s, in honor of a Native American man, Jesse Red Hawk, who was killed in Vietnam. And that takes its place right alongside of that very European window in the present Holy Cross Church, Episcopal Church out in Pine Ridge. I was there on 9/11 last year. That was a very interesting experience. Next one. Okay, this, and you probably recognize from the bishop's bulletin that he sent to his patrons, this is the church that was actually in Pine Ridge when Wounded Knee 1 took place. And it's a very simple wooden church, red door. Episcopalians usually have a red door on their church. And it obviously doesn't have any colored glass. But I took a picture of this glass because this glass is pretty old. And it was probably there when the survivors of Wounded Knee were taken to this church when it was in Pine Ridge. And they were treated in the sanctuary by Dr. Charles Eastman, who was the first Native American graduate of the Dartmouth Medical School. And he married an Episcopalian lady school teacher, Elaine Goodale. And they were out here working among the Indians. And they just happened to be here when Wounded Knee took place and treated the survivors in this building, which is now near Longman and Oklahoma. Okay, next one. Sometimes, because as I said, stained glass is expensive, people don't have enough money to buy it. So they take different tactics. And this was especially true at the Episcopal Church out in White River, which is no longer being used, okay? But you see, what happened was they just painted on the side. And again, we have the Native American iconography. And I'm told that this particular image, although sometimes Native Americans don't choose to share their iconography with a white female researcher, but from what I've been able to determine, many of these designs are taken from the quill work and the designs that they use in their beadwork. And this particular design is that of a warrior. And at the very top, you'll see the cross. So we're symbolizing a Christian warrior, which I think is really interesting. Okay. Calvary Cathedral in Sioux Falls. Again, this window reflects the mission of the church to work among the Native American people, and it's dedicated, the center part, the two side parts are new, but the center part is dedicated to Reverend George Pepe, or deacon. I guess he was not a reverend, he was a deacon, and he was the first Native American deacon in the Dakota area. And so they dedicated this, the Good Shepherd. Oftentimes, the Good Shepherd is used to memorialize ministers and caretakers, because everyone wants to be a good shepherd, just as Christ was a good shepherd. Okay, next one. Well, maybe.
All techniques of failure.
Wait,
I'll walk over there, and then it'll zoom.
No problem.
now try it.
There we go.
See, it works every time, doesn't it? One of the most significant windows in the church is the Bishop Hare's window. Bishop Hare, as you know, was the first Episcopalian bishop in the Dakota Territory. And there's quite a story about this window, which Donna and her husband say I should tell you, okay? Bishop Hare was, first off, the window was given to Calvary Cathedral by Mrs. John Jacob Astor, the first Mrs. Astor, who apparently came to South Dakota and cried on Bishop Hare's doorstep. And she wanted a divorce from John Jacob Astor. And South Dakota was initially sort of the divorce capital of the world. It was even worse than Las Vegas. And, but anyway, Bishop Hare took pity on Mrs. Astor with her traveling companion, who was a gentleman. And Mrs. Astor, the first Mrs. Astor, received a divorce. Well, then Bishop Hare found out through, ministers and priests and nuns, they have their own little network, okay? And Bishop Hare found out that the first Mrs. Astor was basically not a very nice lady, and he was very opposed to divorce. And so when she sent him this window, he was absolutely appalled, because he and Bishop O'Gorman, who was the Catholic bishop, by this time mounted a campaign to strengthen the divorce laws and make it harder to get a divorce in South Dakota. And so he was quite upset that this Mrs. Astor, who ended up marrying this man who had come out here when she was seeking the divorce, and then John Jacob Astor ended up marrying his 19-year-old secretary. And when they were returning from their honeymoon in Europe, they had the mischance to take the Titanic home. And John Jacob Astor perished on the Titanic, and his pregnant wife, this 19-year-old woman, survived. But anyway, Bishop Hare did not approve of all this philandering at all. And so when this window arrived at the church, he promptly assigned it to the basement and wrote Mrs. Astor a scathing note, sort of chastising her for her immoral behavior, and that he was not going to put this window in his church as a memorial to her divorce. So apparently the window sat in the basement, and Bishop Hare died, and eventually the window was placed in the cathedral, where it still is today. And maybe 25 or 30 years ago, people thought it was a really ugly window and that it was not very colorful. And then they started cleaning it or investigating it, and they found out that it had come with a covering, a protective covering, when it had been shipped, which had never been removed. So because Bishop Hare was very upset about this window, he wrote her a letter and said, you know, take it back. And she said, no, I don't want it back. Right? So it's had in the basement. Anyway, they removed the protective covering, and now it's a very, very beautiful, vibrant window. Okay, next one. One of the biggest questions I get as I travel around the state, everybody thinks their windows are made by Louis Comfort Tiffany. I think that the New York auction houses in the 1950s really created a market for Tiffany windows. And so everyone who has a window of the late Victorian style with opalescent glass thinks it's a Tiffany window. It's probably not. And in South Dakota, there's only one Tiffany window, and it's in Sioux Falls, and it's in the Girls Episcopal. We could have the next picture. It's in the Episcopal All Saints School, which was a boarding school for women that Bishop Hare established. And the window was given in memory of one of the students who died. Can you go to the next one? Okay. Mabel Natwick, and she died in the influenza epidemic around 1910. The reason that we know that this is the only Tiffany window in our entire state is because Tiffany kept pretty good records, and he had a catalog where he presented, where he documented every window by city, state, church. This is the only one in South Dakota. Next one. Wow. Well, then we're almost, how are we doing on time? Pretty good? Okay? We're okay on time? While Tom's trying to get into that is the angel of resurrection, and it was as the light changes, you can see the star up here, depending on what the light is. All right. Do I need to walk over here? Themselves as the mother church in South Dakota. Their windows are probably the oldest, and maybe we could just flip through these. The oldest surviving windows in the state, and we just kind of flip through this, and I won't, because I'm busy and I'm probably getting close to church time. And they're very beautiful. They're picture windows. And we go again. Here we go again. And go again. And then I want to talk to you about, and then I'm almost done, about the unlikely beginning of stained glass in South Dakota, in the Dakota Territory. It was probably at, we have the next slide, Fort Randall, down on the Missouri River, which is where there was the federal government established a fort during the Indian Wars. And the soldiers, they were sort of, the Civil War was kind of just ending at that time. Yes, we know we're registered. And so
just hold on.
The soldiers didn't have very much to do, and so they decided they needed a church. And this was about 2 years before Bishop Hare came.
It'll go.
And So they built this church out of native sandstone from that area, this chapel, okay? And what was really significant to me, the Army Corps of Engineers had survived when they built the Fort Randolph Dam, and the Army Corps of Engineers have since stabilized the ruins and put this roof over it. But as a stained glass person, the thing that really interested me was when I was doing research, it said that they had stained glass, and I don't think it was leaded glass. I think it was colored glass in these windows, but it's obviously not there now. And the fort was abandoned in 1891, and nobody knew what happened to it, okay? As a stained glass person, what really interested me was that this fort sits right on the Missouri River, and it's on a great big sandbar. Well, what's the element, you need sand, okay? And you got a bunch of bored soldiers out there, and their commanding officer's daughter's getting married, so they build this church, and the mother, who was European, the commanding officer's wife, was very socially prominent in the East, and she needed stained glass. So my theory is they made it right there. The Army Corps of Engineers thinks it came up the river, but I don't know. We don't know that yet, but we're investigating. And that was one of the things that in my travels, this was what the old church looked like. And then in 1907, this church was called Christ Church. I've never seen a church that wasn't an Episcopal church that was called Christ Church. You know, there's no Christ Church Lutheran churches or no Christ Church Catholic churches. The Christ Church is usually Episcopalian, but it was before the bishops came. And the fort documents say that the Catholic soldiers did not worship here. So I'm thinking this was probably very early, even before Bishop Hare came. This was an Episcopal associated. And if you take a look at the present church in Lake Andes, you're going to notice some really interesting similarities. And when I asked the Army Corps of Engineers, they were so delighted not to talk about flooding or Native American artifacts. Stained glass, I love this project. You'll notice that the architectural features are very similar. And when I had, the Army Corps of Engineers has detailed architectural drawings, and the measurements of these are exactly the same. So my theory is that once the fort was abandoned and they needed to do something, they moved the windows from there. They took out the glass and either tipped it around or did something else with it there. So how do you prove this? Well, I convinced the Army Corps of Engineers that I needed some sand because I took it to Sioux Falls and they're melting it and we're going to see what color it turns out to be. And if it turns out to be the color of that green glass in the last slide, well, that'll be interesting, won't it? And it would be very exciting to find out that we've actually made stained glass here in South Dakota. So I spent Thursday at the Archaeological Center here in Rapid City going through thousands of shards of glass. And while we didn't find anything colored, except bottle glass, I'm not real discouraged because when they did the archaeological dig at Fort Randall, the blacksmith shop where it might have been made using the sand from the river and the forge, and the blacksmith shop was down by the river, that area has been flooded. And so there was never an archaeological dig. So if there's any evidence there, it's underwater. They've never done an archaeological dig at the chapel, and we might do that this summer. This is Thursday, what I did on Thursday. This is the life of the stained glass stone. And as you notice, that glass kind of has a green tinge to it, which is kind of interesting. It's obviously machine rolled glass. I don't think this glass was made here, but it has a lot of copper in it because look at how it's getting that opalescent patina on it. And I just think that that green color was kind of interesting. And hopefully now we're going to make it right in time for church. Thank you so much for asking me to come. Happy 125th birthday. You should be very proud and inspired by your windows, and it's been such a pleasure talking to you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Barbara. If you're here after church, we'd like to invite you to come to church. It starts in a few minutes. And more questions we may have for that.
I'll be happy to sit with you.
be here, so if you have questions, we'll do that. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Next forum is June